The Germans tightened their steel noose around Bastogne, the 101st Airborne fought through blood and frost, and every general declared there was no rescue, until Patton turned his army against the storm, crushed the enemy's pride, and tore his way into history. In that moment, the rules of war shattered, commanders trembled, and the world learned that the impossible only exists for those who accept defeat. This is the full saga of heroes forged in fire. Heroes never die, and we keep them alive every time we tell their story. Snow drifted sideways across the Belgian countryside, hanging in the air like frozen smoke, blurring roads and trees and the silhouettes of men who were already too weary to care about the cold. It was December 1944, and the German gamble in the Ardennes was unfolding with a brutality that none of the American commanders had expected. In Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded, cut off, and stubborn in the way only paratroopers could be. But by then stubbornness wasn't enough. Ammunition was running thin, medical supplies thinner, and every hour the German artillery turned the battered town into more rubble. The men of the Screaming Eagles held anyway, because they'd been told to hold, and because in their bones they believed someone, somewhere, would come for them. But who that someone would be, and whether they'd arrive in time, no one could say. Far to the south, in Luxembourg, General George S. Patton paced in front of a fireplace in a commandeered villa, working a map with his gloved finger as he muttered under his breath. The Third Army had been preparing an offensive of its own, one Patton believed might shorten the war, but Eisenhower's headquarters had ordered him to turn north instead. The Germans had broken through, they threatened to split the Allied front, and no one besides Patton seemed both willing and able to shove two entire corps 90 degrees in 3 days and throw them straight into a blizzard. The kind of maneuver instructors at West Point called impossible and quartermasters called suicidal. Patton considered both assessments compliments. Bradley sat nearby, hands clasped, expression carved from something between worry and calculation. He was the mild-mannered foil to Patton's thunder, but he knew the problem as well as anyone. If Bastogne collapsed, the whole Bulge could turn into a catastrophe. The 101st was more than a division. It was a symbol of what American soldiers believed about themselves. Losing it would echo all the way to Washington. Patton stabbed the map again. We go here, through Arlon, through Neufchâteau, then straight into Bastogne from the southwest, he said. Bradley studied the lines, shaking his head. These roads are narrow, frozen. A convoy will jam up the moment one truck skids. Patton shrugged as if logistics were someone else's religion. Then we don't skid. Bradley sighed. You make it sound simple. It's not. Patton replied, war favors audacity, not bookkeeping. Bradley didn't argue, but he didn't agree either. While staff officers debated fuel allotments, weather forecasts, and the state of the armored divisions, a different kind of conversation played out in Patton's head. He remembered the humiliation in North Africa, when the press treated him like a barbarian and Washington treated him like a liability. He remembered Sicily, and the slapping incident that nearly ended his career, and the quiet fear that he'd never get another chance to matter. But now the world was burning again, and once more the chaos needed a man who believed victory was carved by boldness and speed. If there was a better moment for redemption, Patton could not imagine it. On the morning of the march, the Third Army rolled north like a mechanized avalanche. Tanks churned, ice into muddy spray, half-tracks rattled, artillery tractors groaned forward, and infantrymen marched under packs heavy enough to break a mule's spine. The snow clawed at their eyes and froze their boots, the wind whipping across the open plains as if the entire Ardennes resented being disturbed. All along the columns, chaplains said quick prayers over engines that wouldn't start and radiators that threatened to crack. In the sky above, Allied pilots circled but rarely dove. Low clouds and swirling snow made target spotting nearly impossible. Aircraft that did brave the storm often returned with ice crusting their wings, so heavy a pilot could barely keep level. For the Germans, that weather was a blessing, for Bastogne, a curse. The 101st needed supplies, and the only way to deliver them was through the air. But even the bravest pilot could not fly blind through the Ardennes without courting death. Inside Bastogne's ruined buildings, paratroopers made jokes to hide their unease. An enlisted man lit a cigarette with fingers numb from the cold and muttered about how this was supposed to be the division's rest period. Another carved a hole in a wall so he could fire his rifle without exposing more of himself than necessary. When a mortar shell slammed into a barn across the street, sending hay and splinters through the air, no one flinched, flinching wasted energy. When the Germans demanded surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe sent back a single word: nuts. It traveled like wildfire through the American lines, giving men something to grin about between bombardments. But confidence did not cure exhaustion, nor did it conjure bullets. The 101st was running low on everything except pride, and pride could not stop panzers. On December 23, the weather began to clear. The sky turned a hard winter blue and sunlight glinted off fields and frozen rooftops. Aircraft engines roared overhead, and soon parachutes blossomed across the landscape like white flowers against churned earth. Boxes of ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and blood plasma drifted down. Men cheered, whistled, and waved. It wasn't rescue, but it reminded them that the war beyond Bastogne had not forgotten them. By then, Patton was close, but close meant little in war. The Germans defended the roads with artillery and dug in infantry, and every mile had to be bought. Tanks burned on crossroads, medics dragged the wounded across frozen ditches, and officers studied maps under flickering lanterns, trying to guess where the next ambush would erupt. Bradley received reports every hour, some encouraging, some bleak. He spent much of his time staring out a window, hands behind his back, thinking not of glory but of accountability. Command, he knew, was not about making bold decisions. It was about living with the consequences. When news arrived that Patton's lead elements were only 6 miles from Bastogne, Bradley allowed himself a rare smile. If anyone could do it, he murmured, it'd be him. One of the staff colonels raised an eyebrow. Even Patton can't change the weather or widen those roads. Bradley replied quietly, perhaps not. But he can make men believe they can. Patton himself rode in a command car near the front, wrapped in a coat lined with fur and wearing gloves that made him look more like a Russian nobleman than an American general. Snow clung to his helmet, melting slowly as the engines in front spat heat. Every few minutes he demanded a situation update, and every few minutes a radio operator shouted over the static as shells thundered in the distance. Patton's smile looked half feral, half divine, like a man who delighted in battle not for its blood but for its test of will. Just after midday on December 26, the first tanks of the 4th Armored Division smashed into German positions outside Bastogne. The defenders fought stubbornly, but their lines cracked, and by mid-afternoon American armor rolled into the battered town. Paratroopers crawled out from rubble-filled buildings, waving helmets and rifles, shouting greetings drowned by engines. One tank crew tossed rations and cigarettes to airborne troopers who had been living on little more than determination. A young corporal patted a Sherman's glasses plate as though thanking a draft horse. The sky overhead was streaked with smoke as if the war itself were exhaling. When Patton arrived hours later, he found McAuliffe standing beside what had once been a schoolhouse. Patton dismounted with a theatrical flourish, his boots crunching over ice. "Glad you held," he said simply. McAuliffe grinned. "Didn't plan on doing anything else." Patton nodded once, then walked the streets as paratroopers looked on, whispering and pointing. The legend had become flesh. The man who talked like fire and moved like thunder had come for them after all. That night, in his temporary headquarters, Bradley reviewed the reports. The relief of Bastogne wasn't the end of the Bulge, not yet. Fighting would continue into January, and the winter would claim men even when bullets didn't. But a disaster had been averted, and the German thrust would never again threaten the same degree of rupture. A war that could have tilted suddenly toward calamity had instead lurched toward its final, inevitable conclusion. One of the younger officers asked Bradley what he made of Patton's achievement. Bradley leaned back, weighing his words the way a chess player studies a board. "You can say many things about George," he finally said, "and God knows people have. He's reckless, he's impatient, he loves war too much for comfort." Bradley paused, letting the image settle. But when the situation is desperate, when you need someone who'll act instead of deliberate, there is no one better to have on the field. The officer nodded, scribbling in his notebook, but Bradley was not finished. He looked up again, eyes distant. Patton didn't just relieve Bastogne. He proved something to every commander in this army. That victory doesn't always belong to the best plan. Sometimes it belongs to the man who refuses to accept anything else. Outside, the guns still rumbled, and snow still fell, soft but relentless. Soldiers on both sides huddled against the cold and dreamed of homes that felt impossibly far away. But for the men of the 101st Airborne, the night felt different. The circle had been broken, the noose loosened, and hope breathed again. And somewhere beyond the lines, the Germans felt something colder than winter, the creeping realization that the tide of war had turned for the last time. Bradley closed the map, folded his hands, and added one last remark, spoken quietly but meant for history itself. "Patton saved them," he said. "And he saved more than the 101 Street. He saved our confidence." Then he exhaled, as though releasing a burden he'd carried for days, and allowed himself the rare luxury of rest, even if only for an hour. The Bulge would collapse. The war in Europe would end. Men would go home and try their best to explain a winter that could never truly be explained. And when history later asked how Bastogne endured, and who carved a path through snow and fire to reach it, Bradley's words would linger like frost on glass. Patton saved them, and in doing so reminded the world that audacity, when paired with competence and conviction, can change the direction of a war.